What if I told you that 14 days from today, not 6 months, not a year, 14 days, your body could be running on a completely different fuel source? One that repairs arterial damage, reduces the chronic inflammation that has been accumulating in your tissues for years, and triggers a process in your brain that most people in their 60s have never been told is still possible? All of it from removing one single substance from your diet. Carol was 67 years old, a retired elementary school teacher from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She came to see me for a routine follow-up on mild type 2 diabetes, the kind her physician had labeled well-managed for 4 years. She was tired most afternoons. She had gained 12 pounds in the last 2 years without changing her diet in any noticeable way. Her joints ached in the morning. She assumed all of it was aging. I asked her one question. "Tell me what you eat for breakfast." She described oatmeal with a drizzle of honey, a small glass of orange juice, and a cup of coffee with 2 sugars. She said, "It's healthy, right? No processed food." I told her we were going to run an experiment. 14 days, no added sugar, none. No honey, no juice, no sugar and coffee, no exceptions. I told her to write down how she felt every morning and bring the notes back. She came back 14 days later with 3 pages of notes. She had lost 6 pounds. Her morning joint pain had reduced significantly by day 9. By day 12, she told me she had not needed her afternoon nap for the first time in 2 years. What happened inside Carol's body during those 14 days is exactly what I am going to walk you through today. Mechanism by mechanism, day by day. My name is Dr. Chandler. I specialize in gerontology and age-related metabolic disease, specifically how sugar metabolism changes after 60 and why the consequences of chronically elevated blood glucose are dramatically more serious in the aging body than in younger adults. After 60, your cells become progressively less responsive to insulin, the hormone that escorts glucose from the bloodstream into your tissues. This process, called insulin resistance, means that even a blood sugar level your physician describes as acceptable may be causing measurable damage to your blood vessel walls, your liver, and your nervous system. Damage that compounds silently, year over year, until it surfaces as something your doctor can no longer label borderline. A 2022 study published in Cell Metabolism found that adults over 60 with sustained dietary sugar reduction showed measurable improvements in insulin sensitivity within 9 days, accompanied by a statistically significant reduction in inflammatory cytokine levels in the bloodstream. The authors noted that the magnitude of improvement was greater in adults over 60 than in younger cohorts, suggesting that the aging metabolism responds more dramatically to sugar reduction, not less. Stay through to the end, because what I am going to reveal about what happens to your brain on day 14 of sugar elimination, specifically a process involving a protein called BDNF, is something most people in their 60s have been told is no longer available to them. The science says otherwise, and I will show you exactly why. Here is what your physician is unlikely to have explained, because a standard appointment does not allow the time. At 35, your body manages a sugar spike with reasonable efficiency. Insulin is released, blood glucose is cleared, your cells absorb what they need, and the system resets in a few hours. At 65, that same sugar spike triggers a different sequence. Insulin resistance means your cells respond sluggishly. Blood glucose stays elevated longer. Prolonged exposure to elevated glucose chemically damages the endothelium, the inner lining of your blood vessels, through a process called glycation, where glucose molecules bond to proteins in the vessel wall, stiffening and inflaming them. Your kidneys work harder to filter the excess. Your liver receives signals to store the excess as fat within the organ itself, a condition called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And, crucially, the inflammatory response that sugar triggers in the aging body does not resolve as quickly as it did at 35. It lingers, it compounds, and it silently accelerates the vascular changes that produce heart disease, cognitive decline, and neuropathy, all of which you may be attributing entirely to getting older. Some of what you are calling aging is diet. and 14 days of evidence will show you exactly how much. Phase 1. Hours to 72. The metabolic handoff. Change 1. Hours to 24. The cravings spike before they disappear. The first 24 hours are the most uncomfortable and the most important to understand because most people quit here and draw the wrong conclusion. When you remove sugar from your diet, your blood glucose drops. Your body, accustomed to a steady supply of rapid-release glucose, interprets this drop as an emergency. It signals the release of cortisol and adrenaline, stress hormones that stimulate appetite and specifically drive cravings for fast-absorbing carbohydrates. You will feel hungry in a way that seems disproportionate to how recently you ate. You may feel slightly irritable, mildly headachy, and mentally foggy. This is not a sign that your body needs sugar. It is a sign that your body has been dependent on it and is now being asked to shift fuel systems for the first time in years. The discomfort is real. It is also temporary. In most adults over 60, this peak passes within 36 to 48 hours as blood glucose begins to stabilize at a lower, steadier baseline. Carol described day 1 as irritable and tired by 2 p.m., day 2 as a little better. By day 3, she stopped writing about cravings entirely. Change 2. Hours 48 to 72. Blood sugar stabilizes. And something unexpected happens to appetite. By the end of the 3rd day, something measurable shifts. With no sugar entering the system, the cycles of blood glucose spike and crash. The mechanism that drives constant hunger begin to flatten. Blood glucose levels stay within a narrower range throughout the day. And for the first time in years, many people experience what genuine metabolic satiety feels like. The sensation of not being hungry without having just eaten. The hunger hormone ghrelin, which spikes every time blood sugar drops, is no longer cycling as aggressively. The satiety hormone leptin, which has been partially blunted by years of insulin resistance, begins to reassert itself. You stop eating on a schedule driven by blood sugar volatility and start eating when your body actually needs fuel. A 2020 randomized controlled trial in JAMA Internal Medicine found that subjects who eliminated added sugar for 72 hours showed statistically significant reductions in fasting ghrelin levels and improved leptin sensitivity compared to control groups, with the effect size notably larger in subjects over 55, consistent with the hypothesis that aging amplifies the metabolic response to sugar reduction. Most people describe this shift as one of the most surprising physical experiences of the experiment. Not because it is dramatic, but because they had forgotten what it felt like not to be perpetually slightly hungry. Phase 2. Days 4 to 10. The body sheds and repairs. Change 3. Days 4 to 6. The water releases. Between days 4 and 6, you will likely lose between 3 and 8 pounds. Possibly more. This is not fat. Not yet. What you are losing is water that your body was retaining specifically because of sugar. Every gram of glycogen, the stored form of glucose that your liver and muscles maintain as an energy reserve, is stored alongside approximately 3 grams of water. When you remove dietary sugar, your body begins drawing on those glycogen stores for energy. As the glycogen depletes, the bound water is released and excreted. Your tissues are less waterlogged, your inflammation is beginning to reduce, and your cardiovascular system is under measurably less fluid pressure. Carol wrote on day 5, "Jeans fit differently this morning. Didn't expect that." Change 4, days 5 to 8. Post-meal energy returns. Think about the last time you ate a full lunch and felt genuinely energized afterward rather than sleepy. When you consume a high-sugar or high-refined carbohydrate meal, your blood glucose spikes rapidly. Your pancreas releases a corresponding surge of insulin. In adults with any degree of insulin resistance, which includes the majority of Americans over 60, diagnosed or not, that insulin surge is excessive relative to the cellular response. Blood glucose drops faster and further than it should. Your brain interprets this post-meal drop as a signal to reduce activity and conserve energy. You feel heavy, unfocused, and sleepy. Not because you ate too much, but because the glucose curve was too steep and fell too fast. By day 5 to 8 without added sugar, those curves flatten. Blood glucose after eating rises moderately and falls gradually. The post-meal crash disappears. Your afternoon energy becomes available, possibly for the first time in years. Carol stopped needing her afternoon nap on day 8. She noted it with 2 exclamation marks in her journal. Change 5. Days 7 to 9. Visible inflammation begins to reduce. Around the end of the first week, 2 changes that are physically visible begin to appear. Skin clarity improves and joint stiffness, particularly morning stiffness, begins to lessen. Both trace back to the same mechanism, the reduction of systemic inflammation driven by dietary sugar. Sugar activates a family of inflammatory signaling molecules called advanced glycation end products, AGEs. These compounds cross-link proteins in the skin, reducing elasticity and promoting a dull, thickened appearance. They inflame the synovial lining of joints, the tissue that cushions the joint cavity, producing morning stiffness and the low-grade ache that most people over 60 attribute entirely to arthritis. When sugar is removed, age production drops. The inflammatory signals diminish. The skin's collagen structures begin recovering elasticity. The synovial lining reduces its inflammatory state. A 2021 study in Arthritis and Rheumatology found a dose-dependent relationship between dietary age intake and synovial inflammation. For every 10% reduction in dietary age exposure, synovial inflammatory markers decreased by an average of 8.3% within 7 days. The researchers identified refined sugar and processed carbohydrates as the primary dietary source of age precursors. Change 6. Days 8 to 10. The liver begins its own recovery. By the end of the first week and into the second, a change is occurring deep inside the body that no scale and no mirror will show you. But that may be the most consequential of everything happening during these 14 days. Your liver is beginning to release the fat it has been storing. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease affects an estimated 25 to 30% of American adults and is driven primarily by excess dietary fructose, the specific sugar molecule found in table sugar, high fructose corn syrup, and fruit juice. Unlike glucose, which can be used by virtually every cell in the body, fructose is processed almost exclusively by the liver. When fructose intake chronically exceeds the liver's processing capacity, the excess is converted to and stored as fat within the liver cells. When you remove dietary sugar, fructose intake drops to near zero. The liver shifts to a different metabolic mode. It begins mobilizing the fat it has been storing, converting it to ketone bodies that the body and brain can use as fuel. The liver is literally beginning to clean itself out. A 2019 clinical trial published in Annals of Internal Medicine found that adults with confirmed non-alcoholic fatty liver disease who eliminated added sugar for 8 days showed a 22% reduction in hepatic fat content as measured by MRI spectroscopy, independent of total caloric intake. Phase 3. Days 11 to 14. The deep repair. Change 7. Days 10 to 12. Your arteries begin to breathe. By the second week, a change is occurring in the cardiovascular system that has direct implications for your long-term heart disease and stroke risk. Chronically elevated blood glucose damages the endothelium, the inner lining of your arteries, through glycation. Glycated endothelial cells lose their ability to produce nitric oxide, the compound responsible for arterial dilation and blood pressure regulation. They become sticky, attracting LDL cholesterol particles and inflammatory cells that form the plaques associated with atherosclerosis. And they stiffen, reducing the vessel's ability to expand and contract with each heartbeat, which directly elevates blood pressure. When sugar is eliminated, the glycation rate drops. The endothelium begins producing nitric oxide again. Vessels begin to recover their elasticity. In clinical measurements, this shows up as an improvement in a metric called flow-mediated dilation, the ability of the artery to widen appropriately in response to increased blood flow. The improvement is measurable within 10 to 12 days of consistent sugar elimination. This is not a hypothetical long-term benefit. It is a structural change in your arterial system that begins within the window of this 14-day experiment. Change 8. Days 11 to 14. Insulin sensitivity begins to restore. One of the most medically significant changes occurring during the second week is one that no symptom will announce. It is happening at the cellular level, in the receptors embedded in the membrane of every muscle cell, fat cell, and liver cell in your body. Insulin receptors, with the molecular docking sites that allow insulin to deliver glucose into your cells, have been partially downregulated by years of chronic high insulin exposure. Your pancreas, facing persistent insulin resistance, has been producing more and more insulin to achieve the same glucose clearance effect. When sugar is removed and blood glucose stabilizes at a lower baseline, insulin demand drops. The pancreas reduces its output, and the cells, no longer bombarded by constant high-concentration insulin signals, begin upregulating their receptor sensitivity again. They become more responsive to lower amounts of insulin. The metabolic feedback loop that has been running in the wrong direction begins to reverse. Carol's fasting glucose at her 14-day follow-up was 11 points lower than at her previous appointment 4 months earlier. Her physician called it remarkable progress. She had changed nothing except removing sugar from her diet. Now I want to tell you about what I promised at the beginning. The change occurring on and around day 14 that most people over 60 have been told, explicitly or implicitly, is no longer available to them. Around day 10 to 14 of consistent sugar elimination, your body completes a metabolic transition. With liver glycogen largely depleted and dietary glucose input minimal, your liver begins producing ketone bodies, specifically beta-hydroxybutyrate, at meaningful concentrations. These ketones enter the bloodstream, cross the blood-brain barrier, and become the primary fuel source for your neurons. That fuel transition triggers something that has become one of the most significant findings in contemporary neuroscience. Ketone metabolism directly stimulates the production of a protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. BDNF is, in the most literal biological sense, a growth hormone for your brain. It supports the survival of existing neurons, promotes the formation of new synaptic connections, and here is what most people over 60 have been told is impossible. It actively supports the generation of new neurons in the hippocampus, the brain region most critical for memory consolidation and spatial navigation, and the region most severely affected in Alzheimer's disease. Neurogenesis, the birth of new brain cells, occurring in a 67-year-old brain. Not because of a pharmaceutical, not because of a procedure, because you stopped putting sugar in your coffee. A 2022 review in Nature Reviews Neuroscience confirmed that beta-hydroxybutyrate acts as a direct epigenetic regulator of BDNF gene expression, increasing its transcription in hippocampal neurons. The authors identified dietary sugar elimination as one of the most accessible and rapid means of elevating ketone levels sufficient to produce measurable BDNF effects, with neuroplasticity markers detectable within 10 to 14 days of sustained low-glucose dietary conditions. The same review found that chronically elevated blood glucose actively suppresses BDNF production through inflammatory pathways, meaning that every day of sustained high sugar intake is not only failing to support your brain's regenerative capacity, it is actively working against it. Carol told me on her 14-day visit that she felt mentally sharper. She was specific. She had completed a crossword puzzle she had been stuck on for a week. She had remembered 3 names at a family event that she would normally have needed her husband to supply. 14 days, 9 measurable biological changes, a metabolic handoff, a structural repair cycle in the arteries and liver, an inflammatory reset in the joints and skin, and a neurochemical shift in the brain that most of medicine has not yet found the language to communicate clearly to a 67-year-old retired teacher. The experiment costs nothing. It requires no prescription, no procedure, no equipment. It requires 14 days of one specific decision, repeated at every meal. Carol is now 18 months into what she called a 14-day experiment. She has not gone back. Before you go, I want to ask you something specific. Have you ever tried eliminating sugar for more than a few days? What happened? And when did you stop? Write it in the comments. Tell me which day was the hardest. Tell me whether you noticed any of the changes I described: the afternoon energy, the joint stiffness, the clarity around day 12. And tell me your age, because everything I described today, the timeline, the magnitude of the changes, the brain response, shifts depending on where you are in the aging process. I want to calibrate what I cover next around who is actually in this audience. If this gave you a framework you intend to use, like 14 days, 3 phases, 9 changes, subscribe. Because what I am covering next is directly connected. The specific foods most Americans over 60 are eating every morning that they believe are sugar-free, and that are producing exactly the blood glucose and insulin patterns I described today. One of them is on almost every nutritionist's approved list. The research from the past 3 years tells a different story. One more thing before you go, and this is important. Everything I showed you today assumes you know which foods actually contain sugar. Most people think they do. Most people are wrong. There are 7 foods currently in the average American senior's daily diet that are marketed as healthy, labeled as no added sugar, and that produce blood glucose spikes indistinguishable from eating a candy bar. 2 of them are regularly recommended by primary care physicians as part of a heart-healthy diet. That video is on your screen right now. Watch it before your next grocery trip. What you find there will change what goes in your cart, and it will determine whether the 14 days I described today actually produce the results Carol got, or whether you stop at day 3 wondering why nothing is working. I will see you there.